The day the sky burned purple was the day everything changed for the people of New Roma. Senator Marcus Aurelius stood on the marble steps of the Grand Temple of Jupiter, watching as the massive golden statue began to crack. The cracks spread like spider webs across the divine metal, and then something impossible happened. The statue crumbled into gray dust that scattered in the wind like ashes from a dying fire. Across the colony world of Terra Secundus, similar events were happening at the same moment. The Temple of Mars collapsed into rubble. The sacred flames of Vesta extinguished themselves without any wind or water. The oracles of Apollo went silent mid-prophecy, their eyes turning from glowing gold back to ordinary brown. Every sign of divine power simply vanished, as if someone had turned off a switch that controlled all the magic in the universe. The beings that humanity had worshipped as gods for 3,000 years were leaving. They did not say goodbye. They did not explain why. They simply withdrew their presence from the mortal world and disappeared into whatever dimension they had come from. The Pantheon, those powerful alien entities that had guided human civilization since the days of ancient Rome on Earth, had decided that their experiment with humanity was over. High Priestess Julia Vesta fell to her knees in the ruins of her temple. She had served the goddess Vesta for 40 years. She had kept the sacred fire burning through storms, through wars, through plagues. Now the fire was gone, and she felt hollow inside, like a house that someone had removed all the furniture from. Around her, other priests and priestesses were crying, screaming, or simply standing in shocked silence. The news spread across the 12 colonies, faster than light itself could travel. The gods had abandoned humanity. The beings that had given humans faster than light travel, that had taught them to terraform worlds, that had protected them from the hostile aliens of the galaxy, were gone. And in their absence, the technology they had gifted was failing. The blessing engines that powered starships began to shut down. The divine shields that protected colony worlds from cosmic radiation started to weaken. The sacred weapons that had kept humanity safe from the Kreth Empire began to rust. Admiral Gaius Maximus received the news while commanding the 5th Legion fleet near the border of Kreth space. His flagship, the Divine Fury, was one of the most powerful vessels in the human navy. But as he watched, the golden glow that had always surrounded its hull began to fade. The ship's blessed cannons, which had been able to destroy enemy vessels with single shots, powered down and refused to restart. Within an hour, the Divine Fury was reduced to little more than a floating metal box with no weapons and barely functioning engines. The Kreth detected this weakness immediately. Their sensor arrays picked up the dying energy signatures of human ships across the border. For centuries, the insectoid aliens had been held back by human divine weapons. They had lost millions of warriors to the blessed flames of Roman warships. Now, they sensed that the flames were extinguished. The Hive Queens gathered in their deep caverns and made a decision. The time for revenge had come. Senator Marcus gathered the emergency council in the ruins of the Senate building. Half of the building had collapsed when the protective divine wards failed. Dust still hung in the air, and several senators had bleeding wounds from falling debris. But there was no time to find a better location. Reports were coming in from every colony. Panic was spreading. People were rioting in the streets, demanding answers that no one had. Marcus stood before his fellow senators and spoke words that no Ramon had ever spoken before. He told them that the gods were gone and they were not coming back. He told them that the Kreth were massing for an invasion that would likely begin within days. He told them that their blessed weapons were useless and their divine shields were failing. And then he told them something that made the entire chamber go silent. He told them that humanity did not need gods to survive. Some senators laughed at this idea. Others called him a heretic and a fool. One ancient senator, a man who had served the Temple of Jupiter for 60 years, actually tried to attack Marcus with his ceremonial dagger. But Marcus stood firm and continued speaking. He reminded them of the history that the gods had made them forget. Before the Pantheon arrived, humans had already built great civilizations. They had conquered disease and famine. They had reached into space with their own crude rockets. They had split the atom and harnessed its power. The gods had not created human potential. They had merely directed it. In the following days, Marcus organized a massive effort to preserve what remained of human civilization. Teams of engineers were sent to study the failing divine technology, trying to understand how it worked so they could rebuild it with mortal hands. Scholars dove into ancient databases, searching for the knowledge that had existed before the Pantheon arrived. Soldiers trained with conventional weapons that did not rely on blessings or sacred flames. The first Creth attack came 2 weeks after the abandonment. A swarm of 100,000 insectoid warriors descended on the colony world of Olympus Minor. The local garrison had only 3,000 soldiers and no functioning divine weapons. By all measures, it should have been a massacre. The Creth expected to sweep through the human defenders like fire through dry grass. They did not expect Commander Helena Scipio. Helena was not a divine champion or a blessed warrior. She was simply a soldier who had spent her entire career studying tactics and strategy. When the divine weapons failed, she did not despair. Instead, she began to improvise. She ordered her soldiers to dig trenches and build fortifications. She had engineers construct primitive explosive devices using industrial chemicals. She studied the terrain and identified choke points where small numbers could hold against larger forces. When the Creth swarm descended, they found not panicked civilians waiting for slaughter, but determined defenders dug into positions of advantage. The first wave of insectoid warriors charged directly into minefields that killed thousands instantly. The second wave was funneled into narrow canyons where human marksmen picked them off one by one. The third wave was met with concentrated fire from improvised artillery positions that Helena's engineers had constructed in just 3 days. The battle lasted 72 hours. When it was over, 60,000 Creth warriors lay dead on the fields of Olympus Minor. Helena had lost 800 soldiers, brave men and women who had died holding the line. But the colony survived. For the first time in 3,000 years, humans had won a major battle without divine assistance. News of the victory spread across the 12 colonies like wildfire. Senator Marcus used it to rally the people. He gave speeches in every major city, telling the story of Helena Scipio and her impossible victory. He told the people that this was what humanity could achieve when they believed in themselves rather than relying on absent gods. The tide of despair began to turn into something else. It began to turn into anger, determination, and fierce pride. Admiral Gaius refused to accept that his fleet was useless. He gathered the finest engineers and mechanics in the Navy and put them to work studying the failed blessing engines. It took them 3 months of constant work, but they finally understood the basic principles behind the technology. The divine power had been a shortcut, a way to achieve results without understanding the underlying science. Now that the shortcut was gone, they had to learn the hard way. The first human-designed faster-than-light engine was ugly, inefficient, and required 10 times the fuel that blessed engines had needed. But it worked. Admiral Gaius personally commanded the first test flight, risking his own life to prove to the fleet that humanity could still reach the stars. When his ship emerged from its jump, exactly where the calculations predicted, a cheer went up that could be heard across the entire shipyard. Within a year, the 12 colonies had transformed themselves in ways that would have seemed impossible during the age of divine dependence. Factories that had once produced sacred artifacts now manufactured practical weapons and tools. Schools that had taught prayers and rituals now taught mathematics and engineering. Temples that had housed golden statues now served as laboratories and research centers. The Creth launched their main invasion with a fleet of 5,000 warships, expecting to face a crippled and demoralized enemy. Instead, they encountered the reformed Roman navy, equipped with human-designed weapons and crewed by soldiers who had something to prove. The Battle of the 12 Stars lasted for 6 days and resulted in the complete destruction of the Kreth invasion fleet. Admiral Gaius personally led the final charge that broke through the enemy lines and scattered the surviving Kreth ships into the void. High Priestess Julia, who had wept in the ruins of her temple on the day of abandonment, found a new purpose in this changed world. She transformed her order from keepers of sacred flames into teachers and healers. The discipline and dedication that had once served divine purposes now served human ones. Her former priests became doctors, engineers, and scientists. The knowledge they preserved became the foundation for new advances that surpassed anything the gods had given. 10 years after the abandonment, Senator Marcus stood before a crowd of 1 million people in the rebuilt capital city. Behind him rose not temples to absent gods, but monuments to human achievement. Statues depicted scientists, soldiers, doctors, and builders rather than divine beings. The eternal flame that burned at the center of the plaza was kept alive not by magic, but by a fusion reactor designed entirely by human minds. Marcus told the assembled crowd that the gods had done humanity a favor by leaving. They had forced humans to rediscover their own potential, to remember that they were the masters of their own fate. The Pantheon had kept humanity as children, dependent and weak. Now humanity was growing up, becoming something stronger and more capable than the gods had ever intended. In the depths of space, far beyond the borders of human territory, the beings that had called themselves the Pantheon observed these developments with something that might have been surprise. They had expected their former worshippers to collapse into chaos and destruction. They had expected the Kreth to sweep humanity from the galaxy within a generation. Instead, they watched as humans built a civilization that was beginning to rival their own. Jupiter, the entity that had worn the face of the King of Gods, turned to his companions and spoke words that echoed across dimensions. He admitted that they had underestimated the small creatures of Earth. He suggested that perhaps they should return and reclaim their faithful followers before humans became too powerful to control. But when they reached out toward the mortal realm, they found something unexpected. Humanity had built defenses not just against the Kreth, but against divine interference itself. The barrier that now surrounded human space was crude by Pantheon standards, but it was effective. The gods could not enter without an invitation, and humanity had no intention of inviting them. Commander Helena Scipio, now Fleet Admiral Helena Scipio, commanded the defense station that maintained the barrier. When the Pantheon sent their first message requesting permission to return, she transmitted a single word in response. The word was no. The message continued with a simple explanation. Humanity had learned to stand on their own feet. They did not need gods anymore. They did not want gods anymore. The temples had crumbled into worthless dust, and from that dust, humanity had built something better. The Pantheon could have forced their way through the barrier. They had the power to tear it down and reclaim their worshippers by force, but something stopped them. Perhaps it was respect for what humanity had achieved. Perhaps it was fear of what humanity was becoming. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that the experiment had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, just not in the way they had planned. Humanity spread across the galaxy in the centuries that followed, building an empire that dwarfed anything the Pantheon had envisioned. They encountered other species that still worshipped their own gods, and they shared the lesson they had learned in blood and fire. Gods were crutches that prevented civilizations from reaching their true potential. Only by standing alone could a species truly discover what it was capable of. The old temples on Terra Secundus were preserved as museums, reminders of a time when humanity had looked to the sky for salvation. Children visited them on school trips and learned about the age of dependence. They walked past the empty pedestals where golden statues had once stood and heard the story of how their ancestors had risen from despair to greatness. The dust of the crumbled gods had become the foundation of human triumph, and that foundation would stand forever.